I'm very excited because we're going to kick off now with a brand new book from a world-renowned scientist and expert on health and nutrition. Full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of this man's work. He's called Dr. James Nicoleantonio. He's a cardiovascular research scientist and a doctor of pharmacy at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City, Missouri. He's the author of the earth-shatteringly important and best-selling book, The Salt Fix, which explodes a lot of myths around salt, including the myth that it's bad for you, Superfuel, The Longevity Solution, and his latest, which is Making Waves. It's highly topical in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's called The Immunity Fix. And Dr. James D Nicoleantonio joins me now. Hi, James.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, we're very excited to have you. Extraordinarily topical, your book. I don't imagine that you had conceived a pandemic would be upon us when you started to write this book.
Well, I essentially started writing it because of what was happening.
So you seized the opportunity. It wasn't just a serendipity.
Well, it was because there's so many things that people can do to improve their own immune health. I think it's important that, people understand this because it's not being talked about, And so in the UK, Boris Johnson just announced a 1-month lockdown because cases are now 22,000 a day in the UK. And over 1,000 people are dying every single day now in the UK from COVID. So, that's the reason why I wrote this book, The Immunity Fix, so people can understand what they can do to support their own immune systems.
And although you obviously are a man of excellent timing, in fairness to you, it has been a through line in all of your work. And all three of your best-selling books is essentially, the root of everything that you stand for is about boosting immunity because it's something that we are equipped with from birth. And it's just that lifestyle factors are what are eroding our immune system.
Yes, 100%. And nutritional deficiencies. You have 1 billion people globally have vitamin D deficiency, and half the global population are vitamin D insufficient. And vitamin D deficiency increases your risk of dying from COVID by 10-fold, and it increases the risk of having a poor COVID outcome by 20-fold. So those are hazard ratios equivalent to smoking cigarettes and lung cancer, and yet we don't hear about this in the news.
It's extraordinary. Well, we'll come to the pandemic and why this book is, at any time well worth reading, but perhaps now it might just save your life. Let's get down to brass tacks, if we may, James. What is the immune system?
Essentially, the immune system comes from your bone marrow. Your bone marrow produces stem cells, which can form into any single cell in the body, including immune cells. So immunity is really having healthy bone marrow, having healthy immune cells, right? So you have your innate immune system, which is sort of the first response immune cells, and you have your adaptive immune system, which is like your T cells and your B cells. And essentially that makes up your entire immune system. And so the most important thing people can do is diet, lifestyle, exercise, and of course there's certain supplements too that can help support the immune system.
Indeed. And it's strange, isn't it? Because the immune system sometimes gets a bad reputation. Certainly if you sort of speak to some doctors, some quarters of the medical community, when they talk about medication, they talk about more or less, attacking the immune system or slowing it down somehow and stopping the immune system as though it's a bad thing.
Well, we cover that in the book too. So essentially what you're referring to is sort of like autoimmune diseases, where basically your immune system starts seeing your own cells as a foreign substance and starts attacking yourself. And so that's essentially an overactive immune system. And really what ends up happening is you have certain immune cells that are called T regulatory cells. They're supposed to regulate how well your immune system functions. And when those go down and suffer, you can start getting things like autoimmune conditions because the regulators, all of a sudden, they're not doing their job, and now the immune system is sort of overactivated.
So therefore, in fact, the immune system, whilst it exists to protect us, if we have an unhealthy lifestyle and there are environmental factors that are negative for our immune system, then it can become a destructive force.
100%. So, I mean, if you look at essentially the metabolic health of people in the UK and the United States, essentially 8 to 9 out of every 10 adults have some type of metabolic dysfunction. And that increases your risk of dying from COVID by 3.5-fold, and it increases the risk of ending up in the ICU by 4.5-fold. So essentially, all of us are just metabolically sick, and that's why you're seeing such higher rates of hospitalizations and poor outcomes from COVID in the UK and the US compared to many other places in the world.
Well, that's it. Now, you've explained with characteristic precision what the immune system is. Could you tell us what metabolic ill health is, or a metabolic disorder that so many of us have, possibly don't even know we've got?
So metabolic syndrome is a cluster of at least 3 out of 5 different things: elevated blood pressure, elevated blood glucose, elevated waist circumference, elevated triglycerides, and then low HDL, or low good cholesterol. If you have 3 out of those 5 factors or more, you are considered to have metabolic syndrome, and that increases your risk of dying from COVID-19 by 3.5-fold.
And this is not something we're born with. It's not genetic necessarily. I guess the propensity for metabolic syndrome might be genetic, but ultimately it is lifestyle related, ultimately.
100%. Essentially, the 60% of the US and UK diet is made up of processed foods. So essentially refined carbohydrates, refined sugars, and omega-6 seed oils.
Yes. So now, what is a carbohydrate? Because there's a lot of confusion around carbohydrates. And are all carbohydrates bad?
No, there's certainly good carbs and bad carbs, just like there's good fats and bad fats. And so essentially what I consider good carbs, I mean, you can start with bread. So I use a rule of 5 to 1. If you're choosing bread, you want to make sure there's no more than 5 grams of carbs per 1 gram of fiber. You want to make sure that it doesn't last more than 5 days out of the refrigerator, or that's not true real bread. And essentially, most whole grain breads are highly processed and aren't actually a good carb. So almost every single bread out there, unless it's prepared in traditional ways, is highly refined. So that would be a bad carbohydrate, which is why just simply avoiding most breads is a great step in the right direction. And then, of course, your good carbs would be things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, even, the Okinawan purple sweet potatoes are, some good carbohydrates. And, of course, your vegetables and, onions and peppers and all things like that, your greens.
And, of course, a simple rule of thumb is that you should eat real food. And I guess if you eliminate products, food-like substances that come out of a box that have an ISBN number, then you're on the right track.
Exactly. So the golden rule is don't consume anything with more than 5 ingredients, or really try not to consume anything that's coming out of a box. If you can't get it from nature, it's probably not real food.
And what are processed carbohydrates then? And what are we talking about here? I mean, is bread, does that categorize itself? Because people would think of bread as something very natural, a very basic, almost biblical food stuff, wouldn't they?
Well, it depends how it's processed. So if it's a traditional sourdough bread and the flour has not been ran through a steel roller mill, but has been sort of hand pounded or stone pounded, then that's more of a traditional bread. But unfortunately, 99% of all breads are ran through steel roller mills. The flour is highly refined and pulverized, and you have something that spikes your blood sugar and insulin levels, and that's a refined carbohydrate. And same thing with rice. Most people kind of view rice as sort of being potentially even healthy, but it's far from it.
Really? Now, why is that? I'm imagining with rice, it's those hidden sugars that people are perhaps not aware of.
It's so refined now, rice. It's not even, how it used to be. Used to sort of be like, hand pounded. Now it's sort of, stripped of all of its fiber, stripped of all of its nutrients, and you're just left with starch and no nutrition. Even most brown rice is fairly low in fiber and fairly low in nutrition. Unless you can get things like wild rice with a high fiber content and a lot of phytonutrients, most rices should pretty much be avoided or kept to a minimal intake.
Now, my impression, having read the book, is that your focus is blood glucose levels. And I think a lot of people listening will think that the concern around high raised blood glucose would be eating sugar. But it goes beyond that, doesn't it? And some of these foods that you've mentioned are just as culpable as sugar itself at raising your blood glucose.
Well, essentially you want to just avoid anything that's inflammatory. And one of the worst things that everybody thinks is good for their health is these refined omega-6 seed oils, like, corn oil, safflower oil, soybean oil that is kind of integrated in all our food products and we're told to cook with because it lowers cholesterol, so to speak. Those are the most susceptible oils to oxidation. Before you even consume it, it's highly oxidized. And so these omega-6 refined seed oils, in my opinion, and I've published many papers on this topic, are really doing a ton of damage to our metabolic health.
Now, this goes back to real food, doesn't it? Because butter, coconut oil, olive oil, sustainably sourced palm oil, those are all very stable oils, which we were told in the 1960s, 70s and 80s would give us a massive heart attack. But in fact, the opposite is the case.
So essentially, what you're saying is pretty much, 100% accurate. When you look at animal fats, they're primarily saturated fat or monounsaturated. So they don't have a lot of double bonds. They're not highly susceptible to oxidation. And if you can source them from, grass-fed cattle, for example, that's going to be better than your factory farmed cattle. But olive oil, if extra virgin olive oil, is great too because it's so high in polyphenols, even though it has some polyunsaturated fats or these little more double bonds than your animal fats. Because it's so high in polyphenols, it prevents the oil from oxidizing when you cook it. And that's probably why olive oil is associated with, lower risk of, heart attacks and strokes when people consume it through a Mediterranean type of diet.
Yeah, so it's obviously very surprising to people to hear that oils marketed as healthy, such as sunflower oil, rapeseed oil, and generally these vegetable oils, which I think that's a misnomer, isn't it, the word vegetable, because they are processed oils that come from seeds and they're not mechanically achieving the oil from seeds, are they? They're sort of stripping any oil out via sometimes chemical means.
Right, so that would be hexane. So a lot of times they have to use chemicals to get these oils out of these hard seeds that you can never just, kind of squeeze. Like you can squeeze oil out of an olive, but, try to crush like a cottonseed or, you're not going to get much oil out of it. So it requires millions of dollars of machinery and high pressure, heat, hexane. And so you're just oxidizing the oil before it even gets into your body.
Now, again, many people will be listening to this and thinking, wait a minute, I've got to start eating butter and lard and olive oil and, maybe we'll come to cheeses in a minute. All of these saturated fats, people will be so worried about heart disease. And still, if you look at the official medical guidelines in this country and the United States, it's very much to keep your saturated fats low. So you've got your work cut out here with this message, haven't you, which is weaning people off sunflower oil and getting them to embrace butter.
Yeah, and that's been the dilemma with a lot of people in the nutritional world who are trying to publish because, we focus so much on bad cholesterol. And it's true that a lot of these omega-6 seed oils can lower your cholesterol level, but a lot of times they increase the oxidation of your cholesterol, and that's even worse. And so we've sort of only looked at one surrogate marker, which is bad cholesterol or LDL cholesterol, and we never really sort of pulled the curtain behind oxidized cholesterol, which is worsened by those quote-unquote healthy omega-6 seed oils, and that's the real problem.
Yeah, so, okay, well, it's very clear now that we're not going to have any of those vegetable and seed oils. We're going to eat real food. We're avoiding those sort of starchy, processed carbohydrates, bread, as you say, cheap supermarket breads, pasta, I would imagine. Beer is probably off the menu. Can you tell us what we can eat then? Let's have a look. Let's just sort of look at the glass half full. Take us through the sort of food groups that we should embrace if we're going to boost our immune system.
Well, berries are great for their phytonutrients, blueberries, strawberries, and their low glycemic index. So if if I'm looking for a healthy carbohydrate, I'll go for raspberries, strawberries, something that's fairly high in vitamin C as well, which we need to boost the immune system. And then if I'm going for a healthy protein, I will consume things like wild salmon, sardines, Even pastured red meat is something I can consume, and pastured eggs too. I mean, a pastured egg is very high in iodine, vitamin A, vitamin D. I mean, vitamins that are extremely difficult to get in the diet. And those two vitamins in particular are extremely important for immune function. Healthy nuts like pecans are something I consume as well. And then, I'm particularly trying to boost numerous other nutrients like magnesium. So I will drink mineral waters as well as a source of magnesium, calcium, things like that.
Obviously, at the root of this great debate is whether fat is good or bad for you. And the other great argument is whether fat makes you fat or it doesn't make you fat. So ultimately, your book and your previous books focus on the idea that if you cut back on those processed carbohydrates and keep the insulin low and actually favor healthy natural fats in your diet, the fats will make you thin, which is, again, very counterintuitive.
Very counterintuitive, exactly. So fat itself doesn't necessarily make you fat. It's when you can't process the fat, typically due to a diet high in refined carbohydrates, because you have an elevated insulin level, and that insulin is telling you to store the fat that you're consuming. But if you can drop the insulin levels to a normal, healthy rate, all of a sudden now your whole metabolic health is improved, and you can start processing fats correctly.
So, I mean, do you get quite exhausted, James, by having to contradict the common narrative when it comes to nutrition, given the fact that you're the author also of The Salt Fix, which was an explosively controversial book when it came out, a bestseller, in which you express at great length and with great authority that salt in the right context is not just not damaging to health, but rather essential to optimum health?
Well, I'll tell you what, trying to get the message out that salt is an essential mineral and not a poison has been the hardest uphill battle. And it's kind of ironic that this mineral that's been around, since the dawn of time and makes up part of our blood has been demonized as a poison when we can't even synthesize it. It's an essential mineral. And just like any mineral, there's an optimal intake. And to give the advice on an essential mineral that everyone should consume the lowest amount possible doesn't make sense from a biochemical standpoint. And so, the Salt Fix really was about sort of pitting salt against sugar, and that really it's the overconsumption of sugar that causes people to not handle a normal intake of salt correctly. And that 9 out of 10 times, if people simply cut out the sugar, they can drop their insulin levels and they can stop retaining salt and they can bring back salt to the table.
This is great news. James, do you have 2 minutes to join us after the break just to cover intermittent fasting and then just some of the other key themes of your book?
Sure. Sounds good.
Fantastic stuff. Dr. James D Nicoleantonio is the author of The Immunity Fix. More from James after this. With me right now, coming from New York State in America, I believe it's early afternoon in the United States, the author of the Immunity Fix, Strengthen Your Immune System, Fight Off Infections, Reverse Chronic Disease, and Live a Healthier Life. Its co-author is Dr. James D Nicoleantonio. Now, James, you've co-written this book with Sim Lant, who's the author of Metabolic Autophagy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's another important aspect of the book, and it's intermittent fasting. Tell us more.
So essentially, intermittent fasting is also known as time-restricted feeding, where you're sort of condensing your feeding window down to, instead of, let's say, from 7 in the morning when you wake up to 7 at night, to a more condensed time window. And that could simply be from noon to then 5 o'clock is when you consume your food, rather than from, let's say, 7 in the morning to 7 at night. And I mean, simply just skipping breakfast is a way to intermittently fast. And typically that's what most people prefer. They're not as hungry in the morning. They skip the breakfast and they just have 2 meals a day instead of 3.
Yes. Perhaps we should start listening to our bodies, that you just will eat when you're hungry. And if you only eat when you're hungry, then your body is being far better served, rather than this culture we have of grazing all day long on snacks.
Essentially, so you're never giving your body a break and you're never dropping insulin levels. You're just constantly spiking your blood sugar and blood insulin, and then you sort of crash, and then it's almost like you need that snack and that boost again, and you're stuck in this vicious cycle of constant hunger because of the, altering high glucose levels and then low levels.
So I think you could rename your book Mythbusters, because that is another myth then, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's 100% not the most important meal of the day. In fact, it might be the most important meal of the day to skip. But, some people do enjoy a good breakfast, and maybe they only consume lunch then, but then skip dinner. But essentially, most people find that they can maintain weight the best when they limit their meals to 2 versus 3 per day.
Indeed. Now, this comes back to insulin, the great advantage of eating in a sort of smaller time window. So let's say you just eat, healthily, but just from, let's say, 11 a.m. or midday to 7 p.m. That's the rest of the time that allows the insulin to drop down to a low level. Why is that good? Why is insulin so key in all of this?
So essentially, insulin is controlling what your body does to the calories that you consume. So it either tells your body to store those calories, or if it's low enough, you can liberate those calories for energy and burn it. And essentially, insulin is, a very important hormone. It's not the only one, but it's probably the master hormone that sort of controls all of this happening in the body.
And so it's basically a fat storage hormone. And when it's raised, when it's consistently high, then your body is being instructed to store fat. And when it's low, the opposite happens.
Exactly.
I see. And it's extraordinary there isn't more focus on insulin. The other aspect that I've read about in your book is that raised insulin doesn't only cause, ultimately, obesity in extreme cases, but inflammation and other health issues. So why is raised insulin bad for inflammation?
So, essentially, insulin is a growth factor as well. And so a lot of people who have elevated insulin levels, they start growing more fat cells. They start, growing skin tags. A lot of people with polycystic ovarian syndrome who can't, get pregnant have elevated insulin levels. It's sort of this hormone that used to be low and now it's high, and it drives primarily growth and fat storage. And it together with inflammation is typically what you see with metabolic syndrome.
Right. And then, of course, cancer comes up in your book too. So how can supporting our immune system help in the battle against cancer and the prevention of it?
So essentially, our immune system is what controls when precancerous cells form. Natural killer cells will seek out those precancerous cells and sort of instruct them to die. So a healthy functioning immune system helps to control the, sort of risk of precancerous cells from turning into cancerous cells, because that's really our defense against cancer is our immune system.
Yeah, for sure. So ultimately, there are almost limitless ailments and illnesses that can be prevented if we focus on our immune system. Just imagine in an ideal world, if we enjoyed collectively good immune health, how much of a threat would something like the COVID-19 virus be?
Well, for example, elderly who have a poor functioning immune system are at a 10-fold higher risk of dying from COVID-19. But this doesn't happen with every person that's elderly. It's with people who have a dysfunctional immune system. And so essentially, if you can bring your immune system back to the health of someone who's middle-aged and metabolically healthy, you're going to be at a potentially 10-fold lower risk of dying from COVID-19.
What are your hopes that we can improve the Western diet? Because that's the central plank of this book. Is it's the food, stupid. It's what we eat, and of course I'll come to other factors like sunlight, exercise, and sleep in a second. But in terms of the food industry, it's so powerful, isn't it? And they have such deep pockets and such marketing power and such political influence. So, what are your sort of feelings about the future and our future health in relation to the food we eat? Can we change the Western diet realistically?
Well, I think we vote with our forks, we vote with our wallets, and if we start demanding more healthier foods, then the food industry is going to shift to, ultimately what their consumer wants. So if we continue to buy and purchase their packaged foods, that's what they're going to continue to produce.
Yeah.
But if people and consumers start focusing more on regenerative agriculture and they start focusing on real food, big food will shift towards regenerative farming and things like that. And they already have started to do that in the United States.
Yes, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I don't think you are, James, but in the 80s, there were so many reports about the poor treatment of battery hens. And it became, very well publicized. And I think the public just thought, I don't want to eat eggs or eat chicken that has produced so much suffering in the production of. And therefore, free-range eggs now in this country are somehow mainstream. And before, they were a bit of a luxury. So I wonder whether the free-range eggs is a good sort of template for a more ethical and also healthy approach to food production.
I think you're 100% right. It comes down to consumer pressure. And typically, the food industry will fold if enough of their consumers make an issue with, one of their current products.
And of course, the problem is the consumer needs to know. So people saw these pictures of hens in these awful cages and found it, absolutely horrific. And I feel like the change was almost overnight because of that. But there's a lot of misinformation about what food is good for us and what food is bad for us, including the official guidelines from, for example, the National Health Service in this country. We have this thing called the Eat Well Guide, which suggests that we should be eating lots of these so-called healthy oils like sunflower oils. We shouldn't be having saturated fat, and we should be having lots of bread. I believe that on the chart, in the illustration of the perfect food plate, there's a bagel on there.
Yeah, exactly. So it is true. The sort of pamphlets that we're given for a healthy diet is boiled down to be simple, but it's not healthy. And ultimately, we need to, like you said, fix the education and sort of get at the root problem so people understand what that issue is. And I mean, really, one of the issues that most people don't even realize with factory farming is a lot of these viruses, like coronavirus, that come from bats, they have to have some type of intermediate mammal for it to jump to humans. And typically, what that intermediate mammal ends up being is a factory farmed mammal where they're all sort of, let's say, for example, a feedlot of pigs. They're all sort of aggregated together, and that increases the risk of that virus spreading rapidly among the animals and then jumping to humans. So we need to understand that factory farming animals is a huge risk factor for causing these type of viruses to explode in the human population.
Indeed, although I also wonder whether there are parallels in the debate around how to tackle and manage this coronavirus pandemic in relation to nutrition, because science is still divided, isn't it, about what food is good for you and what food is bad for you. And there will be many eminent scientists in the United States and here in the UK who will to this day say that saturated fat is bad, that salt causes high blood pressure and early death. So, I mean, the biggest challenge is that the science needs to change, and that's going to be the most important factor, surely.
Well, I agree 100%. The science needs to change. The guidelines need to change. And, I think people are starting to realize that what evidence was put out and the recommendations put out back in the 70s and 80s just made things a lot worse. And maybe all of the dietary advice we have been given has actually been incorrect.
Yeah. So we went to a low-fat diet in the 1970s and 80s. And what happened is that we got much fatter, and rates of type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome exploded.
Exactly, because essentially we feared fat and we sort of started over-consuming refined carbohydrates. And, typically it makes up the refined carbohydrates anywhere from like 300 to 500 grams per day, or 60 to 70% of the calories of a typical diet of someone in the UK. And, that's primarily the main driver of a lot of these metabolic issues.
What's great about the book is that a lot of it boils down to common sense, and a lot of what you recommend in the book is free. So intermittent fasting costs nothing. In fact, it will certainly save you money because you're probably not grazing all day on expensive processed snacks. You're eating real food, so you're going to save time. Some of the other things in your book that are free are sunlight, sleep, and resistance exercise. So do you want to just give us an overview about some of those amazing tools that are at our disposal that can help us?
Well, back in 1918, when the Spanish flu was decimating the world, they treated those patients with what was called like open air therapy. They would take patients out of the hospital, allow them to stimulate their skin with sunlight, and give them fresh air. That's how they used to treat people. And now we're living in a society where we're told to put on sunblock, avoid the sun, and we're essentially, almost 90% of the time throughout the day, we're indoors, not getting sunlight, not getting fresh air. And so something that is free to all of us is we can step outside, we can go for a walk, we can get fresh air, and we can get some sunlight, at least for the next potential 1 month.
Indeed. And then sleep, obviously, absolutely essential, very underrated, partly because if you don't get enough sleep, you get cortisol. And what is cortisol?
Yeah, so cortisol is the stress hormone, and you're right. So we sort of evolved with this 24-hour dark light cycle. We used to be exposed to very bright days and very dark nights, and because we live in cities with artificial lights, and we typically are indoors now, we're not getting exposed to the sun in the morning, which helps regulate melatonin production and sets your circadian clocks, which are important for your immune system as well. And we're not getting daylight throughout the day. And we're not getting, even sunlight and looking at sunsets, which are important too for setting our circadian clocks. And so it's this artificial light at night, which reduces the production of melatonin, so we don't sleep as well. And melatonin is not just a sleep hormone. It is concentrated in our bone marrow to protect our stem cells, which eventually turn into our immune cells, from getting damaged. And so we are essentially a society that is deficient in melatonin, which is the protector of our immature immune cells.
Okay, and then a final myth to bust is the idea that going for a jog around the park is the best form of exercise. Explain why there's a better alternative.
Well, essentially what I practice is I do resistance training 3 days a week, which is typically weights, lifting weights to build muscle, to build insulin sensitivity, so the glucose that you do consume can go into the muscle and not necessarily stay out in the blood. And typically, in the 70s, it was promoted to do really long distance running, but you can do overtraining and that can calcify the arteries. And so typically, if you run longer than an hour at a high pace, that can tax the immune system. So there's this window period of maybe 30 to 60 minutes that's perfect for stimulating the immune system. But then you can start overdoing it if you start running for too long of periods of time. And so high intensity interval training is a way to get your cardio, but you're not overdoing it and you're not stressing the immune system.
Clearly, the best way to have a healthy and fulfilled life and to battle what might be the next pandemic is to have a strong and healthy immune system. We're born with it. We just have to support it and feed it the nutrition it requires. You will find all of that information in The Immunity Fix. Strengthen your immune system, fight off infections, reverse chronic disease, and live a healthier life. It's a fabulous book. It's by Dr. James D Nicoleantonio, and it's out now. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Mark.
We'll catch up soon. Fascinating stuff.